Well, our senior reporter Aviwe Mtila was on that plane that was impounded for days in Poland en route to the peace mission to Russia and Ukraine. He joins me now to unpack the debacle. Aviwe, welcome back. I'm sure you were very happy to arrive at home last night. When exactly did you start to realize that something was amiss after leaving South Africa on Wednesday evening?
Very happy indeed, Masego. Happy to even be wearing the suit that I'm wearing because I couldn't, as our luggage was stuck the entire time we were in Poland. So we left on Wednesday evening here, headed to Poland. And, the first sign of trouble was when we were told by the captain that there were delays on our flight on our way to Poland because we had to, circle the Mediterranean Sea, we understand, for at least an hour. That's because we hadn't got flight clearance to fly over Italy. That had to be sorted out while we were still on the flight itself. But eventually we got, of course, the clearance and we landed at about 1:30 on Thursday. That's in the afternoon. Ordinarily, you'd expect to, disembark immediately and then know what's going to happen thereafter. But it took hours for us to disembark, at least 26 hours. But at around 5 o'clock that afternoon, we knew something was wrong. In fact, us as journalists inside that trip, we wanted to write a story just around the president himself and his security, knowing that he's going to Kyiv in Ukraine, and the majority of the Presidential Protection Service was actually on the flight with us. So we were questioning already who is protecting the president, what is the use of them being there at around 5 o'clock. And of course, the presidency, as we tried to inquire these questions, they told us that there were issues that they were sorting out in the background. I guess that was the biggest frustration, Masego, not knowing exactly what was happening, not getting adequate communication, because we were essentially getting drips and drabs of what was happening. It's only around midnight, just towards midnight, where we got the full extent of what was happening after arriving at 1:30 p.m., of course, in that afternoon. It's when we were called outside by the general heading the PPS himself, that's General Aviwe Mtila, calling us as they had, a scuffle. I think it's being shown currently on the screen. What you're seeing is when we were called outside and we were told that there were issues with the Polish side of things. In fact, we were told that we weren't allowed to disembark because of the permits, not only for us, but permits to allow the weapons that the Presidential Protection Service themselves were having. The General Aviwe Mtila spoke of the racial incidents that were happening. They said that they knew from the minute that they got there that there was trouble, but it was escalating at a fast rate. And essentially he said that he wanted the South African media to know exactly what was going on. In fact, while we were being engaged on the visuals that you were seeing right now, one of the female diplomats from the embassy told us of her personal encounter, that she was actually stripped search naked in front of the Polish male authorities. That would talk of just the hostility that they were met with, and they said that in fact they'd never seen such. They'd traveled the world over for years on end, Masego, and they'd never been met with such hostility. And you'd understand that, Masego, this was a trip that was planned months ahead. You understand, of course, for both Ukraine and Russia to accept the African delegation, it would have had those engagements in the background. And while seemingly above board, you'd think that they were well received, not seen as a threat, given that they were allowed to go to both countries. But what was happening now was a clear indication that geopolitics was at play, and essentially their reception wasn't fully accommodated.
And Aviwe, General Mtila basically being on the plane with you as a media contingency, 120 other security. I understand that the president was already with about 25. That's quite heavy, security presence. Did he explain why the need for so many security personnel?
Not in many words, Masego. We don't know whether this was a regular occurrence, but we did know that, of course, the president himself was well protected. He has a close team nearby him. There was 25 to 30 of his personal Presidential Protection Services personnel. This was additional from the South African Police Service as well as the South African National Defence Force. In fact, we weren't even supposed or allowed to show their faces. There were no clear indication why this additional contingency, but essentially you got that this was a wasted trip from their side, as the mission that they were on board, that SAA chartered Airbus for, failed dismally. They left yesterday, of course, coming back to South Africa, not even accomplishing one of the missions that they were set out to do. They were supposed to be protecting the president, both in Ukraine on the first leg of those peace talks on Friday, and also in St. Petersburg on the second leg of those peace talks in Russia. But essentially, they were at the hotel playing pool table with us, of course, as we had to report ourselves on both those missions, both the first leg and the second leg, all the way in Poland, not actually where all the heat and the actual talks were happening.
And Aviwe, I guess the next question is how much was spent on this trip that became, it wasn't really money for value, right? Or value for money?
Not money for value on our personal side of things. You know, Masego, there were talks of some 20 million rand, as we, of course, were frustrated at around 5 o'clock, where we were asking, what was the use of all these 120 or so personnel that were supposedly headed to Russia as well as Ukraine? Was their mission going to be accomplished, given that they were stuck on the flight with us? And that's where the monies came out. You know, we were wondering, is this taxpayers' money? Who's going to forfeit this bill? Of course, given that their mission was failed. And there were a lot of revelations, Masego, as then we, of course, disembarked on the Friday at around 3:30. That's 26 hours later. And we were still hoping we'd go essentially to St. Petersburg, but that was thwarted and thrashed out in the early hours of Saturday morning. At around 5:04 is when we got the message from the presidency that, in fact, we wouldn't be heading to St. Petersburg, but we'd be put in Poland, given that the flight itself was grounded, not allowed to move any further. In fact, Masego, there were glimmers of hope just on Friday at about 11:30, while we had been there essentially for at least 20 hours inside that flight. There were indications that we'd be moving to St. Petersburg, and there were even announcements from a jovial SAA captain suggesting that our next destination would be headed towards that direction. But of course, it was clear that wasn't going to be the case, as we heard then the change of direction, suggesting that there'd be buses that would be coming to take us and essentially transport us. You'd see that those discussions had failed, because we do understand that there was a discussion with the presidency, minister in the presidency, Nkumbuzo Chaveni, who indicated that they were on the ground negotiating for a way forward for this particular chartered Airbus to move to St. Petersburg, to be at least able to cover the second leg of those peace talks. But of course, that fell flat. Now we hear, for example, in Saturday in the breakfast table, that the particular SAA chartered flight that was transporting us was in the top 5 of the most tracked flights around the world. That alone, of course, raises a number of eyebrows as to what was the curiosity around this particular flight, Masego. A lot of unanswered questions as to what actually was behind all of this. The official word that we get is the permits and the weapons that was accompanying the Presidential Protection Services. But we are told, for example, by General Wally Rhoda that they'd traveled the world over. They'd never had these particular encounters. And you hear the murmurs of geopolitics, given that Poland itself is a close ally of the US and the West, and they have those close relations. So maybe these are sentiments that these conversations and these peace talks wouldn't bode well for the West. Those is what we're hearing on the ground.
All right, senior reporter Aviwe Mtila, safely back in South Africa, just telling us about his experience being stuck in Poland, when in fact he was supposed to be covering the peace mission talks between African leaders, including our President Cyril Ramaphosa and many other African leaders, for example, from even Uganda, to speak about peace between Ukraine and Russia. But that, of course, couldn't happen because they were stuck on the tarmac at a Warsaw airport since Friday morning.